As current globalization process continue to develop toward what it seems to be the global age that we are heading to, we need to look back and examine the first globalism, the first globalization process leading into the first globalism, to have some understanding of the Islamic globalism that gave rise really to modern civilization. The West grew by digesting Islamic culture, Islamic science, and Islamic literature, as well as, of course, the philosophy of Islam. And then this kind of examination should help us have a better understanding of our location in world history. The worst thing we could do is to ignore the grounds upon which our modern civilization stand, because if we do that, we lose the ability to reproduce the values and the attitudes that led to the rise of modern civilization. We could do that at our peril. Unfortunately, many modern historians, particularly European historians, have for so long ignored the fact that our global society, our modern society, is well grounded in Islamic civilization that preceded this civilization and not in the Greek or Roman civilizations. I talked a bit about why is that, and I will talk with more details in the next lecture. But for now, let us focus on the Islamic globalism, understand what it was, and what are the main grounds of that system of globalism. Hi, and peace to all of you. I am Louay Safi, and let us begin by looking at the only historian, Western historian, the American historian, that really gave a credit and identify the Islamic globalism and so its impact on modern society. And I'm referring here to the highly reputed American historian who passed away around the middle of the last century. And he has written 3 volumes, large volumes, under the title The Venture of Islam, in which he had an honest and deep examination of Islamic civilization and Islamic globalism that lasted between the 7th and the 16th century, just 3 centuries ago, that led to the demise and weakening of that civilization. Let me share with you a slide that hopefully will make sense, but that's not a substitute to reading his work, particularly the volume 1 and 2. So what Marshall has pointed out is that if an outer space visitor came to the Earth, like let's say a Martian visitor came to the Earth in the 16th century, he would have thought that the whole Earth and the whole everyone in within that age have become Muslim, even though Muslims continued to be small or relatively small proportion of humanity. And that's because of the extent to which the social models and the economic and political models that they were developed within the Islamic civilization have become widespread and embraced by different parts of humanity. That is what Marshall has pointed out. And of course, he went in his work deeply to examine different facets of that civilization. Now, I would like today to really point to 4 important institutions or practices that were the hallmark of Islamic civilization. And those elements that were developed then have a great impact on our modern world. Beginning with the notion or the principle of the moral agency of people and the rule of law. Definitely, Muslim did not invent the rule of law. This started really in the ancient time. There were always empires that were ruled by law. And the last of them probably is the Roman Empire, which is seen as a model by European societies. But really, this is an illusion that has to do with the way modern society is presented by Western historians and sociologists. Yes, Rome had a law that formed the core of what was known as Pax Romana, the Roman peace. But that law is quite different than the law that emerged under Islam, and we are really have the privilege of using that law to organize our society. The law that came under Islam was, first of all, based on the notion of equal dignity of people, or the right of different communities, different confessional communities, to organize their affairs and to have legal and administrative autonomy. That was not the case under the Roman. Under the Roman, we had a law that privileged the Roman citizens and put them at the peak of law, while suppressed any society that wanted to develop its own culture and values that are not in line with what the Romans wanted. The example, really, the very good example, is what happened to the Israelites, to the Jews in Palestine, when they tried to maintain their religion and their order. They were ordered by the emperor to have his statue resurrected in Jerusalem, and they have really to show reverence as a symbol of divinity. And when they refused, they had, what they had in terms of destruction, and they were sent to exile out of Jerusalem. So first of all, Islamic law recognized the autonomy of various confessional communities, which meant that they can be ruled under their own law, and they can be ruled by their own administrators, people from their own community. At the same time, they had the ability and the right to trade with other communities, whether Muslims or non-Muslims, in the whole region where Islam expanded. That's to say, from the Iberian Peninsula, where Spain and Portugal is now located, to China, and all between. This was a free zone where people could move, have a trade, seek education without any borders or checkpoints to prevent them from moving freely, as long as they were recognizing the Islamic law, which, as we'll see, it was a law that really provided a lot of leeway to different communities. And it was, another thing about Islamic law, it was a law that was not developed by the state. It was developed by civil society, by the jurists, whose base was civil society. Jurists under Islam, particularly in the first 40 years of Islam, before the rule became dynastic, when the rule was based on elected caliph, the scholars developed certain traditions and certain ways to find the rule of law that were kept intact up until the fall of the Ottoman Empire. And that meant that jurists were not really servants of the state. They were grounded in civil society. They have their income coming from civil society itself, from civil society organizations, and particularly from the public trust instrument that they have developed to ensure that there is always funds for them to organize themselves and to organize civil society. I'll come back to this point shortly. But for now, we need to understand that the Islamic civilization was made of confessional communities. So the Armenians, they have their own rules and their own administrators. The Coptic community in Egypt has their own. In Syria, there was a very large Christian community. In fact, as late as the 1950s, about 25% of the Syrian people were of the Christian faith. Many of them now has fled that region, moved to the West, to Europe, United States. Maybe some of them went to South America because of the deteriorating conditions in the MENA region, in the Arab countries, where repression is on the increase, and that is done with the full support of European powers, of those autocratic leaders who keep repressing their communities and turning life into hell on earth in Syria, in Iraq, in Egypt, and just to cite in Lebanon, of course, lately, just to cite a few examples where life really has become unbearable in the last few decades. So then, how could the jurists stay independent from the state? Well, again, the jurists were entrusted with the ability or with the responsibility from the beginning of Islam to try to articulate and to find the rules of law based on the Islamic sources, mainly the Quran, but also the customary laws of the communities, as well as some rules, including the rule of common good that was really developed within the Islamic civilization, as I will point out shortly. So they developed the law, and they made it obligatory for the rulers to abide by that law. For example, Muslim rulers couldn't really determine the taxation as they wish. They had to abide by the 2.5% for individual income that will be even spent in certain ways dictated by the law, and they could have up to 10% taxation on land and businesses. And again, this money would have to be spent in a particular way, including supporting the not well-to-do part of the population, and spending on the wayfarer, and spending on people in need, as well as the need of the state and the community. But all that was really organized and codified by the jurists. And the result is, while the sultans and the caliphs were not really accountable in their day-to-day activities and decisions to the community, but there were certain boundaries that they couldn't cross, and they could cross only at their own peril. And we have example of caliphs and sultans have been, thrown out of office because of their failure to abiding by the rule of law. And the rule of law dictated that other communities who are non-Muslims, Christians, and Jewish communities, and of course the Sabians that were in Iraq, as well as the Hindu who came later on under the rule of the expanding Islamic civilization. These people were able to rule themselves. Now, I'm not trying to suggest that it was a perfect arrangement. Of course, there were abuses, depending on the time and the place, but there were always awareness of the limitation and the danger of going beyond those limitations, because every time rulers were pushed the envelope away from their limitation, they had a populist uprising. Populism, as I pointed out earlier, is really part and parcel of monotheistic communities when their leaders fail to uphold their dignity and the an acceptable level of fairness within running of the state, then populism, the people will rise up to bring their leaders into their senses. So that was an important point that we need to be aware of within the history of Islam. Another point is that by the 3rd century of Islam, Islamic law has developed to such extent that jurists started to realize that it's not always about the text itself, that the revealed text has within it certain universal principles that must be the guiding principles in the process of enacting new law. And of course, in addition to the principle of justice and equality and equal dignity, that's to say, the Muslim jurists found that there was some important principle embedded in all the Quranic pronouncements. That is the principle of common good or public and private interest. That they concluded that the aim of Sharia or Islamic law was to advance the common good of the community and both the private and public interests of the citizens. Let me share with you here the definition provided by one important Islamic jurist, Al-Izz bin Abdul Salam, who lived in the 7th century of Islam, which is around the 15th century of the Common Era. That's the definition of Sharia by the time Izz-ad-Din bin Abdul Salam wrote his most important work, Al-Qawa'id al-Kubra, which can be translated as the general principles. He said Sharia, or Islamic law, is made of pieces of advice that aim at promoting utility and the common good and preventing harm and corruptions. So this becomes the overarching principle of Sharia, and everything underneath it has to contribute or to be seen in that light. And so by the time, by the 4th century, Sharia had a hierarchical structure. It has this universal principle at the top, and then underneath that you have what's called the intent of Sharia, like the protection of life, property, dignity, reason, and religion. These became the 5 cardinal principles of Sharia. And then underneath that, you have the various general rules and then the detailed rules of Sharia. That would include the right of non-Muslims to be let alone to worship according to their own religious traditions. So there was an emphasis on the God-given right for any religious community to abide by their own religion, the religion that they believe in, the religion that they inherited, but don't see any reason to change it to any other religion. And in fact, what the Muslims even did under Islamic law, Muslims outlaw the proselytization. So no one in any minority religious community has to really be worried of people of different religious community coming to their doors and knocking on their doors and telling them, change your faith, join us and become like us. This was completely prohibited. What was maintained is this public debate different religious authorities can debate in the public, or they can debate in the court of the sultan, the court of the caliph, which was a court that brought artists and philosophers and scientists and grammarians to come and share their own knowledge and engage in very spirited debates and with full respect of the diversity of views. That leads me to talk about a third cardinal principle of Islamic globalism, which is the what I call here cultural and religious pluralism. Now, the reason that 25% of the Syrians continue to be Christian for a very late time, and similar number really of the Coptic community. The Coptic community, again, around 1919, it was about 25% of the Egyptian population. Many of them fled their countries to the West because of, again, the rising autocratic regimes that were really created and supported in the post-colonial era. I will come back. I said a few things about that in previous lectures. I'll come back again to talk about colonialism and the post-colonial times that the MENA societies and Muslim societies in general are under. And so it was this plural system that allowed people of different cultures, languages, and religions to coexist and have their own private spheres, while there is a public sphere where they could interact freely in the area of learning, in the area of employment, in the area of trade. All of that was part of that experience. In fact, during the Ottoman years, particularly toward the mid-range of that empire that lasted for about 700 years, the Armenians did very well in the area of trade and the area of artisan. So they were excellent artisan, they were excellent traders, and they were flourished, in fact, more than the Turkish community itself, because another mark of Islamic globalism is that religion and ethnicity played a very secondary role, while what matters the most is the commitment to some of the universal principles that define monotheistic ethics. If you were committed to them, of being honest, being respectful of diversity, being willing to be inclusive and open to diversity, then you would flourish. But if you were otherwise, then probably that would hurt you the most. If you were exclusive, not inclusive, that would hurt you the most. That's what hurt the Umayyads, for example, the first dynasty that took over after the Rashidun, or this wise caliphs period, concluded. They couldn't last more than 50 years because they wanted to give privilege to the Arabs, and they couldn't maintain that because their adversaries, the Hashemites, went and embraced the Persians and everybody else, and did not pay attention to the ethnic background of those who participated in society and in the state itself. So pluralism was an important thing. Maybe I should share with you a couple of texts really to highlight what I meant by that. This is what Marshall Hodgson had to say about the dhimmi. So this pluralism was maintained through a social contract between the Muslim community and other religious communities, and that contract was intended to ensure that the right of non-Muslims for having their own moral and religious autonomy is not intact, is remained intact, and to ensure that pluralism stays throughout the realm. And they have to do that because this was a requirement of the Quran. They had no choice but to do that, but of course, generation after generation got accustomed and saw the benefit of being open to diversity. That allowed the Islamic globalism to stay for 1 millennia. This modern civilization that we see today, it's only 2 centuries old, and in fact, it is in full swing only in the last century. And so to stay for 1,000 years and to have the political leadership move from the Arabs to the Persians to the Turks to the Kurds to the other communities without people feeling really that change was not good for them, and being open to that diversity, that helped a lot in keeping that civilization open and able to change without a lot of resistance. And so this is, I would like to share another it's a long quotation, but really this probably would give you a sense of what I'm talking about. This is a statement by a judge called Abu Muhammad bin Hassan al-Shaybani, who lived in the 3rd century of Islam, which really is about the 9th century of the Common Era. And this is really his judgment. He rendered his judgment. He was a judge, and there was a case that brought to his court involving two villages. One is Christian and the other one is Muslim. And the Muslims were trying to force Christian to stop making wine and raising pigs, because they felt in their religion these are not okay, and they didn't want the Christian to do that. And so the Christians, filed a suit in Baghdad, and then Abu Hassan, Muhammad bin Hassan Shaybani, was the judge. And he says here that Muslims should not appropriate any of the non-Muslims' houses and lands, nor should they intrude into any of their dwellings, because they have become party to a covenant of peace, and because on the day of the peace of Khaybar, which is really a peace that was conducted by the Prophet Muhammad, the Prophet's spokesman announced that none of the property of the covenanters is permitted to the Muslims. So they cannot really try to take that property as a spoil of war. Also because the non-Muslims have accepted the peace covenant so as they may enjoy their properties and rights on par with Muslims. This is the judgment of the 9th century of the Common Era, in a contestation between a Muslim village and a Christian village, and clearly he sided with the Christians because it was the Muslims who were trying to intruding to their own spaces and trying to impose on them their ethical convictions, which were not shared by the Christian community. And that leads me to talk about my final point, the final cardinal principle within the Islamic globalism, that is civil society and the limits on government. The limits on government, I just really talked about how Islamic law limits the office of the Sultan and the office of the Caliph and what they could do. They had always to abide by the rules of law. Again, I'm not suggesting that every one of them did that, but at least that was the principle that governed for most of the time. There were times where society were in shambles, and there were people who took power who didn't deserve it, because, as I said, after the 40 year of Islam, the first 40 year of Islam were run under the principle of consultation, where people voted to the executive, to the sultan or the caliph then. Sultans were not part of the political landscape, but caliphs, the first and second, third caliphs, were elected by the community and were involved in consultation with the leaders within that community. But when dynasties like the Umayyads and then the Abbasid took over, that was stopped, and that created the room for abuse, particularly by certain sultans and caliphs who came to power on the shoulders of their fathers, but they didn't have the caliber and the honesty and justice and fairness of their fathers. Civil society was a very vibrant society throughout Islam. It was a society that organized itself, depending on its own financing. So it developed institutions to finance itself, to finance the making of roads, finance the hospitals and schools, and gave scholarship to those who wanted to pursue knowledge, as well as provided public services, like providing a free public bath. In Isfahan, there was a beautiful free public bath that was described by one of the Muslim travelers, and he said, nobody has to pay to enter that public bath because the funding was provided by a public trust or waqf. Maybe I should here share these last two slides with you. One is about the structure of civil society in the Muslim countries. So there were always guilds and syndicates to organize crafts and professions, from Cordoba to Damascus to Cairo to Aleppo to Isfahan to Istanbul to Samarkand. All those cosmopolitan cities had a lot of organized professions. There was also a network of trade centers spanning across the geography from Morocco to China, and those centers facilitated trade. In fact, you could really buy, pay in your country and get your goods in another country that is thousands of miles away. This is like the prelude to the current banking system. And the cosmopolitan cities were really the linking knots of this very wide civilization from the Atlantic on the one side to the Pacific on the other, with a lot of trade and educational exchange and cultural exchange. So all of that happened within the cosmopolitan centers. So you have this high culture that became the nexus for people who belong to different cultures. The countryside remained diverse, cultures continue to be diverse, but in those metropolitan centers, where many of them, as I named a few of them here, but these centers really were places where people had a free exchange of ideas, and there were a lot of conversions in those centers. Of course, we can know that from modern times also. Modern globalism has developed the same format. There are cosmopolitan cities, New York, Paris, London, even Cairo to a lesser extent, but Istanbul for sure. And then you had Shanghai today, you had Kuala Lumpur in the east, you had many centers where people can go there. And in fact, people feel not at home, but they feel themselves in familiar territories when they go to these metropolitan areas, because there is a lot of exchange, not only of trade, but of education, ideas, culture, and entertainment as well. So that brings people closer to each other. That's all I wanted to share with you. There is a bit more to talk about science, which was really established and developed within the Islamic civilization. I'll come to talk about that in a subsequent lecture. But for now, I hope I shared with you these 4 important institutions and practices that form the foundation of our modern society. The moral agency and the rule of law, not in the Roman and the Greek way, where you have anybody outside Rome is barbarian, has to be dealt with the sword and with the spear, but in an inclusive and open system where no matter what's your ethnicity or religion, whether you believe in Islam or believe in other religions, you have to be respected for who you are, and there is always a trade between countries. Number 2, you have the principle of global pluralism that allowed diversity to remain intact. Remember that diversity is coming back to Europe just in the last maybe 50 years, because Europe, throughout its own history, has tried to purge itself of any religion that doesn't submit or submit to the Christian dogmas. Even Muslims and Jews had to be pushed out of Spain through the Reconquista, while when the Muslims were ruling there, Jews and Christians were part of the community, and many scholars of the Occident from Germany, Britain, and France came to get education in the University of Cordoba. I'll talk about that in our next meeting. And then you have the principle of civil society supported by the Waqf institution, the public trust, where the trust was used to build roads, and in fact to pay jurists, so the jurists could continue to be independent from the state and not relying on the state, and civil society was the ground of legislation, not the state. With this, I'd like to thank you if you remain with me until this point. Please go back and read and view the early lectures. In fact, I have a book that I share with you in the down. You could really download it for free, and I will point to the particular chapter in which a lot of details provided, and of course with references if you are interested to pursue those questions further. And please share your views, comment, let me know what you think. Do you like those talks? Do you have issues with them? Do you have different take on some of what I'm saying? Please do that. If you do that respectfully, I will engage with you, and maybe I could also learn a few things from the possible points to be raised in the comments. Thank you, and God bless you.